He didn't buy the building to own it. He bought it to keep her from leaving. 3 years she had run his world without a single mistake, and the first thing she ever asked him for was to be let go. Rafael Moreno read the resignation letter twice, looking for the lie folded between the lines. When he finally drove to the crumbling block on Faro Lane, where Marisol Reyes paid rent, he could have covered, with the cash in his coat. He expected to find another man, or a better offer. Instead, he found a notice taped to her door, a packed suitcase, and a bruise she hadn't been able to hide. By morning, he owned every brick of the place, and the engagement he'd been promised was the least of what he tore down. The 42nd floor of the Moreno Tower smelled of nothing at all. Raphael had paid a great deal of money to make it that way. The air was scrubbed and pressurized, filtered until it carried no scent of the river 2 blocks east, no diesel from the freight yards he owned, no trace of the city that fed him. It was the cleanest air in Halvridge, and Raphael hated it the way a man hates a thing he chose for himself, and can no longer remember why. He stood at the glass wall watching the harbor cranes load a container ship that flew a flag from a country whose laws he had personally arranged to ignore. Behind him, the office was all pale stone and brushed steel, lit the color of an overcast morning even when the sun was out. Everything in it was expensive, and everything in it was cold. He had designed it to intimidate, and it did. It intimidated him a little too, though he would never have said so. There were days he stood here and felt less like the man who owned the room than like one more costly object placed in it, for effect. "You're frowning at the window again," came a voice from the doorway. "People will think you're sentimental." Drazenkova crossed the room without being invited, which was a privilege he had earned, and one he never let anyone forget. He was lean and sharp-suited, his dark hair combed back from a face that smiled easily and meant none of it. He had been Raphael's second for 6 years. The man who handled the conversations Raphael preferred not to have. The threats that needed a softer voice, the bribes that traveled best with a handshake. He poured himself 2 fingers of Raphael's whiskey without asking, the way he always did, as though the bottle and the room and the trust were all simply things that flowed naturally toward him. "The Albrecht shipment cleared customs," Drazen said. "Your future father-in-law sends his compliments and a reminder that the engagement dinner is Thursday. He'd like you to wear the blue." Raphael said nothing for a moment. The engagement was not a romance. It was a treaty. The Albrecht family controlled the northern rail lines and 3 judges, and the Morenos controlled the docks and the men who worked them. A marriage between Raphael and Sabine Albrecht would knit 2 territories into one, and end a decade of small, expensive wars that had cost both families more in funerals than in money. He had agreed to it the way he agreed to most things, as arithmetic. Sabine was elegant, ambitious, and as warm as a bank vault. They had met 4 times, signed nothing with their hearts, and understood each other perfectly, which everyone assured him was the soundest foundation for a marriage of this kind. "Tell him I'll wear the blue," Raphael said. "He'll be thrilled. He's already picked the church." Drazen swirled his glass, watching the light move through it. "Speaking of arrangements, has Marisol finished the Cayman restructuring? Albrecht's accountants want to see clean books before the families merge. They're a suspicious bunch. They count everything twice." That was when Raphael noticed she wasn't there. It was a small thing, and that was exactly why it stopped him. Marisol Reyes was always there. Her desk sat in the glass-walled antechamber, just outside his office, and in 3 years, he could not recall a morning he had arrived to find it empty before 9. She was the first sound of his day, the soft click of her keyboard, the low murmur of her voice, handling someone on the phone. The particular way she said "Moreno office" that made callers straighten up without knowing why. She knew how he took his coffee, which was to say she knew he never drank the first cup and always drank the second, and she had stopped bringing him the first one 18 months ago, without a single word about it. The way a tide stops bothering with a rock it has finally learned the shape of. She was not loud. She did not posture. She was a soft-spoken, full-figured woman who moved through a building full of dangerous men as though she were too busy to be afraid of them. And somehow, it worked. Raphael had once watched a soldier twice her size apologize for tracking mud across her floor, then crouch down and wipe it up himself while she thanked him by name. She kept his secrets, his schedule, and his temper, and she did it so seamlessly that he had stopped seeing her the way a man stops seeing his own hands. Present, in every act, credited in none. "She's not at her desk," Raphael said. Drazen glanced over his shoulder, indifferent. "Maybe she's sick. Maybe she's late. She's a secretary." Raphael, not a load-bearing wall. But Raphael had already crossed to the antechamber. Her desk was immaculate, as it always was, except that the small framed photograph she kept beside her monitor was gone, and the bottom drawer where she kept her things was closed all the way, which it never was, because the runner stuck and she left it open a finger's width to spare herself the fight. In the exact center of the blotter sat a single white envelope with his name on it. In her precise, unhurried handwriting, he picked it up. It was heavier than a letter should be. He did not open it yet. He stood in the cold gray light with the envelope in his hand and felt, for the first time in a long while, the floor shifting very slightly beneath a world he had believed was nailed down, the brief, sickening tilt of a man who has just understood that something he never bothered to value has been quietly removed. He opened it standing up. "Mr. Moreno," it began. And that alone was wrong, because she had called him Raphael for 2 years. "Please accept my resignation, effective immediately. The Cayman files are finished and labeled in the green drive. The Albrecht account is reconciled through the end of the quarter. Mr. Kova has the passwords for everything else. It has been a privilege. Please don't try to find me." That last line was underlined once, the pen pressed hard enough to dent the paper, hard enough that he could feel the groove of it through the back of the page with his thumb. Raphael read it 3 times. He was a man who had learned to find the lie in any document, the padded invoice, the doctored manifest, the loyalty oath written by a man already planning to break it, and this letter was full of them, though not the kind he was used to. It was too clean. People who quit jobs they hated were sloppy and bitter. People who quit jobs they loved were careful and brief and apologized for things that were not their fault. "Please don't try to find me" was not a resignation. It was a flare fired from a sinking boat by someone who had already done the arithmetic and decided no one was coming. "Well," said Drazen from the doorway, reading the situation rather than the letter. "That's inconvenient. Want me to call HR and have her replaced by Monday? I know a girl from the Albrecht side who's discreet, quiet, won't ask questions." "No," Raphael said. "Raphael." "I said no." He folded the letter once, sharply, and slid it into his breast pocket, over his heart, where he kept the things that mattered and the gun that protected them. "Get her on the phone," Drazen tried. The line rang once and went dead. Not to voicemail, dead. The particular silence of a phone, switched off with the battery pulled. Raphael had taught her that trick himself, years ago, for the days when she carried numbers in her head that the wrong people wanted out of it. He had never once imagined she would one day use the lesson to vanish from him. He found her personnel file in the secure server, and that was the second thing that stopped him cold. Her address was listed as 14 Farrow Lane, Apartment 6. Raphael knew Farrow Lane. It ran along the bad edge of the Hollows, a street of leaning brick tenements and shuttered storefronts where the streetlights had been broken so long the city had stopped sending men to replace the bulbs. It was the kind of place where his own collectors went in pairs and kept the engine running. He paid Marisol Reyes a salary that should have put her in a clean high-rise, with a doorman and a view of the same harbor he watched from his window. He had assumed, he understood now that he had simply assumed, the way a man assumes the air will go on being breathable, that she lived somewhere safe. He had never once asked her a question that would have proven otherwise. "That address is wrong," he said. Drazen looked at the screen. It's the one she gave payroll. Then payroll is wrong, or she is lying to payroll, and either way, I want to know why. Raphael was already pulling on his coat. Where was she yesterday? Walk me through it. Every hour. Drazen spread his hands in the easy way he had, the gesture that made hard things look like small things. She was here. She was fine. A little quiet? Maybe. Quieter than usual, and she's not exactly a chatterbox to start with. She took a long call around 4 and came back from the stairwell, looking like she'd seen the inside of her own grave. But she said it was her landlord, something about the building, repairs, and inspection. I didn't push. He paused, and a small frown touched him. The closest thing to sincerity his face seemed able to manage. She asked me a strange question. Now that you mention it, she asked whether the family ever protected people who weren't blood. Civilians? Outsiders. I told her we protect what's ours, and we don't make charity cases out of strangers. That's the rule. You taught me the rule. He shrugged. And the shrug was the most honest thing about him because it meant he had thought nothing more of it. She thanked me, said that was what she figured. Something in Raphael's chest closed like a fist. He thought of her at her desk yesterday, quiet, asking a question he now understood had not been hypothetical at all, testing the temperature of the only water she had left to step into, and of the man who had answered her by closing the door she was knocking on, and calling it a rule. Get the car, Raphael said. It's Albrecht adjacent down there, the bottom of the hollows. If we're seen poking around 2 days before the engagement dinner, get the car. Drazen studied him for a half-second longer than was comfortable, a flicker of something behind the easy smile, fast and cool and calculating, there and gone before it could be named. And then he smiled, and nodded, and went to make the call. Raphael stood alone in the antechamber a moment longer. The woman's empty chair was turned at the precise 45-degree angle. She always left it, pushed in just enough to say, I am coming back, and he found he could not stop looking at it. The cold, filtered air moved across the back of his neck like a hand. He did not yet know what he would find on Farrow Lane. He only knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent his whole life reading the gap between what people said and what they meant, that Marisol Reyes had not quit because she wanted to leave. She had quit because she was trying to save someone, and he was beginning to suspect that the someone was him. The car came around within 5 minutes, but Raphael spent them at the window again, and this time he was not looking at the harbor. He was looking backward, into the 3 years he had let slide past, without ever once turning them over, to see what was underneath. Marisol had come to him through a man who was now dead, an old accountant named Pell, who had vouched for her with the only sentence Raphael had ever heard him use about another human being. She's the only person I've ever trusted, with a number. Raphael had hired her to manage his calendar, and within 6 months, she was managing his entire legitimate face, the shipping company, the bonded warehouses, the charitable foundation he ran for the taxmen and the newspapers to admire. She had a way of making the dirty parts of his business look clean, and the clean parts look effortless. She never flinched at what she learned. She filed it the way she filed everything, behind a courtesy that gave away nothing. A smile with a steel door behind it? He knew almost nothing true about her. He realized now, and that was a thing he had permitted on purpose. He knew she had a younger brother, she mentioned rarely, and never by his full name. He knew she sent money somewhere on the 1st of every month, because she had once asked to leave early to make a transfer in person, and he had said yes, without asking where it went. He knew she wore long sleeves even in the heat of August. He knew she had laughed exactly 4 times in 3 years, and that he could, if pressed, recall the cause of all 4. He had assembled a careful inventory of a woman, without ever once spending a real question on her, the way a miser counts the same coins every night and never buys a thing. And he had seen the warning. That was the part that sat in him now, like a stone he had swallowed whole. 2 weeks ago, she had come in late, the only time, in 3 years, that he could remember it happening. She had apologized, blamed the bus, and blamed the rain. But her hand had trembled when she set his coffee down, the second cup, the hot one, and he had noticed, because he noticed everything about the way she moved through a room, and he had said, "Are you all right?" And she had said, "Of course," in the voice that closed the steel door. Because a man was waiting in his office with a problem worth more money than her trembling hand appeared to be worth. 3 days after that, he had seen the edge of a bruise above her wrist when her sleeve slid back as she reached across him for a file. Yellow-green at the edges, healing, and unmistakably the shape of a hand that was not her own. He had asked, she had said, she'd caught it on an open cabinet door. He had known it was a lie the instant the words left her, because knowing such things was the foundation everything else in his life was built on, and he had accepted the lie anyway, smoothly, gratefully, because the truth would have cost him an afternoon he had already promised to the Albrechts and their suspicious accountants. He had looked directly at the proof that something was wrong in her life, and he had chosen the wedding instead. The full shape of it arrived all at once, complete and merciless, and it was worse than any betrayal an enemy had ever handed him, because there was no one in the world to punish for it but himself, and he was not a man who knew how to do that. Boss, Tomas, his driver, had appeared in the doorway, keys in one broad hand, steady and quiet and patient as a wall. He had been with Raphael longest of anyone, and asked the fewest questions, which was its own kind of loyalty. Drazen says, "You want the hollows." Faro Lane. I want the hollows. Thomas hesitated, which he almost never did. It's a bad street. That one. We pulled a man out of a stairwell on Faro last winter who'd been dead 3 days before anybody called it in. Nobody ever sees anything down there. He turned the keys over once. You sure you don't want a couple of the boys riding behind us? No, boys. Raphael drew the resignation letter from his pocket, looked one more time at the dented underline, and put it back over his heart. Just you, and you stay with the car. He went down 42 floors in a steel box that smelled of nothing, and, with every floor, the stone in him grew heavier, because he had begun to count all the things he had never asked her, about the brother, the bruise, the long sleeves, the money that left on the first of every month for somewhere he had never thought to wonder about, and he had run clean out of fingers somewhere around the lobby. The city changed by degrees as they drove east, and then all at once. For the first 10 minutes it was Raphael's Halvridge, glass towers, valet stands, clean, wet streets, throwing back the light of signs for banks and jewelers, and restaurants. Then the river came up alongside the road, brown and swollen with a week of rain, and the buildings began to lose their height and their teeth. Glass became brick. Brick became boarded brick. The valet stands became men standing in doorways, with nothing to do and all day in which to do it, watching the long black car the way cats watch a window, without moving, without blinking, missing nothing. Thomas drove smoothly and said nothing. The rain had started again, a fine cold needle rain that hazed the windshield between slow passes of the wiper. Raphael watched the hollows assemble itself around him and felt a slow climbing unease that had nothing to do with the danger of the neighborhood. He had been in worse places, and left bodies in some of them, and everything to do with the single fact that pressed harder the deeper they went. Every shuttered shop they passed, every stairwell yawning black behind a prop door, every gutter running gray, with the runoff of 100 poor kitchens, she walked through all of it. Every morning she put on the careful clothes and the careful face, and she climbed up out of this into his scrubbed, pressurized world, and in 3 years she had never once let a single grain of it show on her. He thought of her saying, "Moreno office," in that level voice, and understood for the first time the discipline it must have taken, the armor she put on in a freezing stairwell before she ever reached the street. "Faro's the next left," Tomas said. "You'll want to brace. The road's gone to pieces." city stopped patching it years back. It had. The car bucked and shuddered over potholes deep enough to swallow a wheel, and the leaning tenements crowded close on either side, 4 and 5 stories of dark, wet brick with fire escapes rusted into black lace. Number 14 stood at the dead end of the lane, the tallest and the worst of them, its front door a sheet of warped plywood where glass had been, its windows mostly dark, a few lit a dim yellow behind sheets and tinfoil. A dumpster overflowed beside the entrance, and the rain had filled the lid's dent into a small black pond. Someone had spray-painted a single word across the boards over a ground-floor window, and the wet had run the paint downward in long streaks until it looked as though the wall itself were weeping. Tomas put the car in park. "I don't like it." "You don't have to." Raphael was already reaching for the door. The cold came in at once, and with it, the smell of the street, wet, stone, rot, river, and under it the sour animal smell of too many people living too close with too little, engine running. "If I'm not back down in 20 minutes, you don't come up after me, you make a call." He named a number, low. Tomas's jaw tightened, but he gave one short nod, the nod of a man filing an order he hoped not to need. Raphael crossed to the plywood door and hauled it open. The hinge shrieked like something alive. Inside, the hallway was a throat, narrow, lightless, but for one fluorescent tube, buzzing and stuttering against the ceiling. The walls, a sweating institutional green that peeled away in long, dry curls. Like a thing shedding a skin it had outgrown years ago and could not finish leaving. The smell here was worse than the street. Boiled cabbage, mildew, cigarette smoke gone stale in the plaster, and over all of it, the sharp chemical sting of cheap bleach, working hard and failing to cover something underneath it that did not want to be covered. Somewhere above, a baby was crying. The endless, exhausted, hopeless crying of a baby that had learned no one was coming, and had decided to cry anyway. A television muttered behind a thin door. Higher up, 2 voices rose and fell in a rhythm worn so smooth by repetition that the words had stopped mattering to either of them. He climbed. The wooden stairs groaned and gave under his weight, each one a different note. The handrail was tacky under his palm, and he did not touch it a second time. Second floor. A child sat on the landing in a doorway, 4 or 5 years old, watching him pass with the flat, unsurprised eyes of a child who has already seen large men climbing these stairs and has learned that the safest thing is to be no one. Raphael held its gaze a moment, then moved on. 3rd floor, 4th. With every landing the dread thickened in him like cooling fat, because this was not the home of a woman who was fine. This was a place a person came to when they had decided to disappear, and she had written "Please don't try to find me," and pulled the battery from her phone. And Rafael Moreno had spent 3 years not asking her a single thing that mattered while she climbed these exact stairs every night in the dark. Apartment 6 was on the 5th floor, at the end of a corridor where the light had given out completely, and he moved by the gray glow leaking through a cracked window at the hall's end. He found the door by feel, his hand flat against cold wood, and then he stopped, because the door was already wrong. Taped to it at eye level, a sheet of stiff city paper hung slightly crooked, and he could just read it in the dimness. The bold black header, swimming up out of the dark, like a word, shouted in an empty room. Notice of eviction. Below it, smaller, worse. The lock plate had been splintered clean out of the frame, the wood around it raw and pale and recent. The screws bent where someone had not bothered with a key. The door was not locked. The door could no longer be locked. Raphael stood in the dark with his hand an inch from the broken wood and listened. And from inside the apartment came a single sound that turned the blood in him to cold river water, a low, careful, pain-thinned breathing. The breathing of someone who is hurt and alone and trying very hard to make no noise at all. He drew his gun and pushed the door open. The apartment was almost empty. That was the first thing, the thing that landed before the rest could catch up to him. He had braced for a struggle, for an intruder still in the room, for a body on the floor. Instead, he swept the gun across a single open room, scoured nearly down to the boards. No sofa, no television, no rug. A thin mattress on the floor in the far corner, the blanket folded into a square, so precise it looked institutional. A cheap folding table holding a laptop, a neat stack of file boxes labeled in her exact hand, and a single coffee mug with a chip in the rim. A suitcase stood by the door, packed and zipped, and waiting. A coat folded over the handle, a bus schedule tucked into the side pocket. The one window had no curtain, only a bed sheet tacked at the corners, and through it, the gray light fell across a life pared all the way down to nothing. No photographs. No plants, no soft or useless or beloved thing anywhere. As though she had been living for a very long time, as a person braced to leave at any hour and had finally been handed the date. Where was her life? He paid her enough for a life. The question hit him with a sick lurch, the same one that had struck him reading her address on the screen, only worse now, because he was standing inside the answer, and the answer was, there isn't one. She spent it somewhere else. The breathing came from the kitchen. He crossed the room and found her on the floor, wedged into the narrow space between the lower cabinets and the cold dead radiator. And the gun in his hand abruptly weighed nothing at all, because there was no one in this room to point it at except the one person in the entire city he would never under any circumstance have turned it toward. Marisol sat against the cabinets, with her legs stretched out in front of her, and she was cradling her own left hand in her lap, wrapped in a dish towel gone dark in patches where the split skin of her knuckles had bled through, and dried and bled again. The back of the hand was swollen huge and the wrong colors, and two fingers sat at angles, fingers were not meant to hold. Her blouse, one of the soft, deliberately ordinary blouses she wore, to make herself unremarkable, was torn at the shoulder seam and gone gray-dark with old sweat. One eye was swollen, nearly shut, the cheekbone beneath it, the deep, furious purple-black of a fresh blow, and her lower lip was split at the corner and crusted. She was shaking, finely, continuously all through her body, the shaking of a person who has been running on fear and adrenaline for far too many hours and has nothing left in the tank to burn. In her good hand, resting on her knee, she held a short kitchen knife, and it was pointed at the door. When she saw that it was him, the knife did not drop right away. Her one open eye fixed on him and did not soften. It sharpened, which was somehow the very worst thing in the room, worse than the blood or the angles of her fingers, because it meant that even now, like this, half-conscious on a freezing floor, she was assessing the threat in the doorway. And for one unbearable heartbeat, she had counted him among the things in the world that might still hurt her. Then recognition crossed her face, and behind the recognition came something that was not relief. It was the exact opposite of relief. The expression of a person watching the single outcome she had spent everything to prevent walk calmly through the door anyway. Raphael, who had stood over more violence than he could put a number to without his pulse so much as rising, whose entire reputation rested on a stillness that emptied the bladders of hard men, felt the breath go out of him as though he had been struck flat across the sternum with a length of pipe. The knife came down slowly. Her hand was trembling too hard to hold it level any longer. It slid from her fingers and clattered against the cracked linoleum, and the sound was very loud in the cold little room. "You weren't supposed to come?" she said. Her voice was wrecked, low and cracked and furious and exhausted all at the same time, straight down to the wire. "I asked you not to come. 3 years. You've never once done a single thing I told you to, and the one time, you finally listened to me, it has to be this." He was already across the room and down on his knees in front of her, the cold of the floor soaking instantly through the wool of his trousers, his hands hovering over her without landing anywhere, because every part of her looked as though it would hurt to be touched. Who did this? It did not come out as a question. It came out flat and quiet and absolute, the voice he kept for the half-second before a room went very still and very bad. She let her head fall back against the cabinet door and closed her one good eye, and something came out of her that was almost a laugh and almost a sob and was finally neither, just a thin, broken breath. "You bought the wrong question," she whispered. "It's not who. It's who sent them, and you're going to wish you'd stayed at your fitting, Raphael, because the man who sent them poured your whiskey this morning." Raphael did not move for a long moment. The name she had not yet said hung in the cold air between them, taking shape, and he watched her watch him begin to recognize it, and neither of them reached for it out loud yet, because they both understood that once it was spoken it could never again be unspoken. "Tell me," he said, "all of it, from the beginning. From the beginning, we'll both freeze to death on this floor." But she shifted against the cabinets, wincing as it pulled at the cracked ribs she hadn't yet mentioned, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into the flat, ordered cadence she used to brief him on the books, because she had clearly decided, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, that the only way she was going to survive saying any of this was to file it like everything else. 3 weeks ago, my brother saw something he was never supposed to see. Cyrus, he's 19. He drives a delivery van, overnights, for a courier outfit on the west side. Cash jobs. No questions. One of his pickups was a sealed shipping crate out of a bonded warehouse off Pier 9. He wasn't supposed to as much as look at it. The seal was loose. He looked. She stopped. Her throat moved. There were people in it. Raphael. Inside the crate. Alive. Not cargo. People. The cold in the small room seemed to drop another full degree. He knew precisely whose freight moved through that warehouse in the dead hours, and it was his, and the trade was supposed to be guns and untaxed liquor. Contraband. Yes, but nothing that breathed, nothing with a face. He had drawn that line himself a decade ago, in blood, and made every man under him swear to it. We do not move people. Whatever else we are not that. He took a photograph, Marisol went on his phone. Stupid, and brave, and 19, all three at once. Then he panicked and called the only person he ever calls when the ground opens under him, which is me, because there's never been anyone else. And then I made the second mistake of the whole disaster. I decided to handle it quietly, the way I handle everything for you. A thin, bitter ghost of pride moved across her broken face and was gone. I'm good at threads, Raphael. You know I am. I pulled this one. I started in the Foundation's freight ledgers and found a tenant on the Pier 9 bond that shouldn't exist. A shell, renting cold storage it never used. I traced the shell to a management company, the management company to the account paying it, and the account back through 3 more layers built so that no one would ever bother to walk them all. I walk them all. I always walk them all. It's the only thing I've ever been good at. And it led inside the house, Raphael said. The words came slowly, like something drawn out of deep water. It led inside your house. Inside the family. Someone has been running people through your piers, under your flag, on your bond, for almost a year, using the one trade you swore this organization would never touch, because it pays 4 times what guns pay and nobody looks for it on your ships, precisely because they're yours. And they've been skimming the take through the same offshore structure. Your future in-laws' accountants are 2 days from inspecting. They were careful, genuinely professionally careful. They simply did not account for the possibility that a tired man's secretary would be better with a spreadsheet than their accountant, and would have nothing better to do at 2 in the morning than keep walking the layers. Her one eye came up. Do you want the name, or do you already have it? Say it, Drazenkova. He had known it was coming. Had known it, he realized, since the flicker behind the easy smile in the antechamber, maybe longer, maybe for months without letting himself look at it. And it landed anyway. Hard, in a place beneath the ribs he had assumed was scar tissue all the way through. Drazen, who had stood beside him at his father's grave, with his hand on Raphael's shoulder, and sworn loyalty to the bloodline in front of 40 witnesses. Drazen, who had poured the whiskey that morning, and reminded him about the blue suit and asked, so lightly, so easily, whether Marisol had finished the Cayman files. Marisol, who had just told him she had found the entire trail through exactly those Cayman accounts. He asked me about the files this morning, Raphael said. He wanted to know if you'd finished them. He wanted to know how much you knew, and he was using your own mouth to find out, because you'd have no reason to lie to him. She nodded slowly, and it cost her. He found out a week ago that someone was inside the structure. I think the landlord here sold me to him. Kova holds the paper on half this block, through one of his shells. I found that too. I found everything. I'm so good at finding things, and it is going to get my brother put in a box. First it was this. She lifted her chin, a fraction toward the eviction notice on the door. Squeeze me out of my own home, isolate me, make running look like my own idea. Then the calls started. We have your brother's photograph, we have his van's GPS, we have his route and his shift and the door he uses, walk away clean, and the boy keeps breathing. Then last night, when a phone call didn't feel persuasive enough, two of them came up those stairs and explained the terms to me in person. She raised the ruined hand a careful inch off her knee. I told them yes. I told them I'd quit, I'd vanish. I'd never say your name or your business out loud again as long as I lived. They could have the photograph and the laptop and me out of the city by the morning bus. Anything, all of it. As long as they left Cyrus alone. And to make sure I'd understood the contract, one of them put my hand on the counter and the other one broke it, finger by finger, slowly, while the first one told me that the day I went to you, the open eye fixed on him, fever bright and unblinking, the day I so much as let your name cross my lips. They would find Cyrus on his route, and they would put him in one of those crates and send him out on the tide. So, I sat down with my hand like this, and I wrote you a letter. I made it clean. I made it boring, on purpose. Because a boring letter from a secretary who's quit is a thing a busy man shrugs at and hands to HR by Friday, and a shrugging man stays alive, and a brother who isn't worth chasing stays alive. And I would have been the only one who ever paid the bill. Raphael stared at her. The whole architecture of it stood up in front of him at once. The trembling hand 2 weeks ago, the bruise blamed on a cabinet, the long sleeves through a brutal summer, the 4 o'clock call that had drained her face to paper, the question she'd put so carefully to Drazen about whether the family protected people who weren't blood. She had been standing inside a fire for 3 weeks, entirely alone, and she had spent every last thing she had, her home, her hand, her job, her whole sparsed down life, not to save herself, but to wall off 2 people who had no idea they were even in danger. One of them was her brother, the other was him. Why? He said, and the single word came out stripped of everything. The authority, the menace, the cold he wore like a second suit. It was only a man asking, why me, Marisol? I understand the brother. The brother I would have died for at 19 too. But you took a beating that broke your hand and you packed a bag for a bus out of your own life. All of it partly to keep me clear of something that's happening in my own house. I'm not your blood. I'm not anything to you. I'm the man who took the second cup of coffee every morning for 3 years and never once wondered who poured the first one. Why spend yourself protecting me? She was quiet for a moment. The rain ticked steadily against the bedsheet over the window. When she finally answered, she looked at the floor between them, not at him, as though the truth were a thing easier to set down if she did not have to watch where it landed. Because, for 3 years, she said, in a city where everything is for sale and nothing arrives when it says it will, you've been the one fixed point. You're a terrible, dangerous man, and you've done things I've filed and never asked about. But you keep your word, and your word held a roof over my brother's head, and a clean bed under my mother's name. And I built a wall around all of that out of pure habit, long before I knew there was a fire coming for it. By the time I understood what Kova was, the wall was already up. Your name was already on it, and I wasn't going to be the one who tore it down to save my own skin. She lifted her eye to his at last. And because I knew that if I told you, you'd do something exactly this stupid. You'd come down here. You'd kneel on a filthy floor in a coat worth more than this building takes in rent, and ask me a question with no good answer, and then start a war you might not win, 2 days before marrying into the only family strong enough to help you win it. Her voice frayed and gave out, I was trying to keep you alive, Raphael, even when it meant lying to you. Especially then. That was the whole point of the lie. He looked at her, the wrecked face, the broken hand, the suitcase by the door of a life she had starved down to a folded blanket and a chipped mug so that she could afford to keep a brother safe and a boss in the dark. And something in him that had been pressurized and scrubbed and held at the cold gray temperature of an overcast morning for a very long time, simply, quietly, caught fire. Hold still, he said. He shrugged out of his coat and laid it over her shoulders before she could form an argument, then took her broken hand in both of his, with a gentleness that matched nothing else about him, and unwound the stiff dish towel just far enough to see. The hand was bad, 2 fingers crooked the wrong way at the second knuckle, the skin split across all of them and angrily inflamed, the back of the hand swollen tight and blue-black, needing far more than a towel. He wound it loosely back, folded the coat's collar up around her throat against the cold, and stood and pulled his phone and made 3 calls in a voice she had never heard him use, the voice he kept for decisions already final, the ones no one would be permitted to reason him out of. The first call was 4 sentences to Tomas. Bring the car to the door, now. Phone Yusuf and put him on the road to the tower. Tell him it's a hand, a face, ribs and a fever already starting, and to bring the full kit, not the bag. The second was 4 words. To a number Marisol did not recognize and would only later learn belonged to the one other man in the entire organization Raphael trusted, without applying a discount. Find the brother first. The third call he placed, while looking directly at her, and it was the one that bent the whole night onto a new track. Wexler, it's Moreno. A pause. I want you to buy a building tonight. I don't care that it's tonight. Wake whoever you have to wake. 14 Tharo Lane. In the Hollows. And whatever holding company carries the paper on it. I want the holding company too. The entire stack. Every unit, every lien. The land it stands on and the air over it. A pause. His eyes did not leave her face. Offered double the assessment. If they balk, offer triple. If they still balk, tell them the alternative buyer is me, in person, at their home, and let them sit with which of the 2 offers they'd rather take. Another pause. Yes. The eviction is void the instant the deed clears. I want it killed, tonight, before the 72 hours run. And put this in writing in front of your notary. No one named Reyes is ever moved out of any property I own, in this city or any other, for the length of their natural life. Wake the notary. I'll hold. He listened a moment, and something in his jaw eased a fraction. Good. Marisol was staring at him with her one good eye. You can't. Raphael, that solves nothing. They don't want the apartment. They never wanted the apartment. They want Cyrus, and they want me gone or silent, and buying the building doesn't touch any of that. It's money. It's a gesture. It's the building, Raphael said, lowering himself back to her level so she didn't have to crane up at him. It's a message, and it isn't even addressed to them. Right now, Drazen thinks his letter worked. He thinks you quit. He thinks you ran. He thinks I read 3 boring sentences and shrugged and called HR, exactly the way he suggested this morning. His mouth went thin. He suggested it himself. Did you catch that? Want me to have her replaced by Monday. He needed me to let you go quietly. The whole architecture only holds if I don't look. So tonight, I buy the one building he was using to turn the screw on you, and I buy it loud, with my name on the deed for anyone to read. and by breakfast he learns that the wall you built around me is still standing. That I'm the one behind it now and that I have started, for the first time in a year, to actually look. He glanced at the suitcase, lifted it once, to feel its almost nothing weight, and set it down with a care more frightening than throwing it would have been. You are not leaving, not the city, not the family, not the desk outside my door. And not because I'm trapping you, though. I'll be honest enough to admit the thought has a certain appeal. You're not leaving because I'm finished, as of tonight, letting other men decide which of mine they get to walk off with. The engagement, she said, very quietly. The Albrechts? You need them. You said it yourself in front of me a dozen times. You can't fight a war inside your own house and hold the piers at the same time without the northern lines behind you. The treaty is the whole reason. There's a flaw in the Albrecht Treaty that I worked out about 4 minutes ago, kneeling on this floor, Raphael said. He slid one arm carefully behind her back and the other beneath her knees, mindful of the rib, and lifted her off the freezing linoleum. His coat fell loose around her, and she weighed so little against his chest that the banked rage in him climbed another notch. The flaw is this. I was about to marry a treaty in order to protect an empire, and it turns out the empire was already being protected, quietly for 3 years. At no charge. By a woman I never once thanked, living in a room with a bedsheet, for a curtain, and her whole salary spent on someone else's care. He carried her toward the broken door. I don't think I need the treaty as badly as I thought I did this morning. I think what I actually needed was to stop being a fool with his eyes shut. Where's the photograph? The one Cyrus took. Is it here? Soon into the lining of the suitcase, she murmured against his shoulder, her good eyes sliding closed at last as the fight finally drained out of her now that for the first time in 3 weeks someone else was carrying the weight. Left side. Behind the seam. 2 copies. There's a third on a drive taped under the radiator in case they took the suitcase. I made redundancies. Of course you did, Raphael said, and something turned over in his chest that was half tenderness and half grief, and not entirely separable from rage. He carried her down 5 flights of groaning stairs, past the child still sitting flat-eyed in its doorway, past the crying baby and the muttering television, and the smell of 100 lives surviving in the dark on almost nothing, and out through the weeping plywood door into the rain, where Thomas already had the rear door open and his broad face arranged into careful blankness. Raphael laid her across the seat as though she were made of struck glass and went back up alone, once, for the suitcase in the drive beneath the radiator, because she had made redundancies and he was not going to be the man who left one behind. He was walking away from an engagement, a decade in the making. He was walking away from the Northern rail lines and 3 friendly judges and the cleanest air in Helvridge. He was walking with both eyes fully open for the first time in a year, straight into a war inside his own house, against a man who had stood at his father's grave. And as he folded himself into the car beside the woman who had nearly died to keep him breathing and ignorant and safe, Rafael Moreno felt something he had not felt in longer than he could measure. He felt entirely, dangerously. The tower's air still smelled of nothing, but for the first time in years it smelled like a nothing he was glad to be standing inside of. Yusuf was waiting in the private suite 3 floors below the office. The floor the building's official plans did not show, the one with the medical bay and the steel door and the drain in the tiled floor. He was a small, precise man who had been a real surgeon once, in another life, before a gambling habit had quietly rerouted his career into Raphael's, and he did not ask questions either, which was the single most expensive quality a man could possess in this world. He set the 2 broken fingers and splinted the hand to the wrist. He taped the cracked rib he found under the torn blouse. He cleaned and closed the split lip and the split knuckles. He ran a line into the crook of her elbow, for the dehydration and for the fever the infected hand had already begun to push up through her. Through every part of it, she stayed awake, gray-faced, jaw set, grimly and completely silent, because she had decided sometime in the last 3 weeks that she was not permitted to stop paying attention, and that decision did not simply switch itself off because someone had finally caught her falling. She needs to sleep, Yusuf told Raphael in the corridor afterward, stripping off his gloves, one finger at a time. Real sleep. Days of it, not the kind where you pass out and call it rest. And she needs to eat. When did this woman last put a full meal in her body? Her system's been running on coffee and terror for the better part of a year. There's nothing left of her reserves. The hand I can fix, the exhaustion I can't, not with a needle. He did not say it as an accusation, but Raphael took it as one and added it to the bill he already owed. Wexler called at 2:30 in the morning. The building was his. The notary had been dragged from bed, the deed was clearing, and the holding company that had carried the paper had folded its hand the instant the name Moreno crossed the table, which told Raphael something useful and precise about Drazen. He had been careful enough to hide behind a cutout, but not careful enough to put a brave man in front of it. The screen Drazen had built was made of paper, and paper burns by 3. The second call came back. Cyrus Reyes was alive. He was being held, not in a crate, not yet. In a back office of the very same West Side courier depot he had driven for, 2 men sitting on him, both of them waiting on instructions that Drazen, it seemed, had not yet bothered to send. Because Drazen still believed the letter had worked, and the situation was sealed, and the boy was nothing more urgent than a loose end he would knot off whenever it next became convenient. That was the seam. Raphael found it the way Marisol found a discrepancy in a ledger, not by searching, but by feel, by the faint wrongness of a figure that refused to sit flat on the page. He thinks it's over, Raphael said. They were in the suite, the lights low, Marisol propped against the headboard with the IV line taped to her arm, and a fierce, fever-lit refusal to be sedated burning in her good eye. He had ordered a tray up. She had eaten exactly enough to make Yusuf stop hovering, and not one bite past it. Drazen thinks you ran. He thinks the photograph went into the river with your old life, and he thinks Cyrus is just a chore he'll get around to. He has no reason on earth to move fast. Which means time is the only edge I have, and not much of it. He'll hear about the building by breakfast, Marisol said. Her voice was thin, scraped raw, but the mind behind it had come fully back online, and Raphael could see it working. You said so yourself. You did it loud on purpose. I did it loud so he'd know I'm awake. But there's a window, a few hours, between Drazen hearing that Raphael Moreno bought a slum tenement in the middle of the night, and Drazen working out why. In that window, he's confused. He's calling around. He's reactive instead of careful. And a man who hates not knowing things reaches for the fastest answer in front of him instead of the truest one. That's the window where careful men make their single mistake. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, and looked at her. I need 3 things, in the right order. Cyrus out of that depot before Drazen panics, and decides a living witness has become too expensive to keep. Drazen brought to a place I choose on a night I choose, believing it was his own idea, and I need to be certain, not 90% certain, that it's only him at the top. A man doesn't run people through a major port under another man's flag for a year alone. If I take Drazen and leave a partner breathing, I've just warned the partner. Marisol was quiet for a moment. And then the strangest thing happened in that grim little room. The fear receded from her ruined face, and what surfaced underneath it was the woman he actually knew. The one who lived inside the numbers, who pulled threads at 2 in the morning, whose mind was the single sharpest instrument in the entire building, and had spent 3 years folded up unused in a chair in a hallway. Then don't take him first, she said. Bait him. He thinks I'm a problem he already solved, so let him keep believing it, but give him the wrong solved problem. Don't be the boss who's discovered a traitor running people through his peers. Be the boss who's discovered his secretary, embezzled and bolted. That's the story. You're not cold and awake. You're hot, furious, humiliated, betrayed by a nobody, sloppy, with rage. You bought the building because you're convinced she stashed the stolen money in it, and you're tearing the place apart looking for cash that isn't there. Let that version reach Drazen. Let him hear that you think this is petty theft, not treason, that you've never heard of Pier 9, that the photograph never existed, her good eye sharpened to a point. A frightened man who suddenly learns his enormous secret is safe, doesn't run. He relaxes, and a relaxed, clever man comes to gloat. He'll call you all warm concern. He'll offer to help hunt down the thieving little secretary. He'll want to be in the room when you find her. Because watching me caught for the wrong crime is the closest he'll ever get to being sure I'm buried. And he'll walk into whatever room you name on his own 2 feet, certain the whole way that it was his idea. Raphael looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, for the first time in that very long night, something that was almost a smile touched one corner of his mouth. "You have been wasted," he said. "Outside that door." "I have always known that," she said, and let her head settle back against the headboard, the fever pulling at the edges of her. "Now go and get my brother out of that depot before you start arranging anyone's funeral." "The funerals can wait. Drazen can wait. Cyrus cannot wait. Raphael, promise me he comes first." "He comes first?" Raphael said. He rose and crossed to the nightstand, and took from the drawer a small flat pistol, checked the magazine, set the safety, and laid it on the blanket beside her good hand, the way a man lays down a key. "This stays with you. Safety's here, you remember I showed you, on the range, 2 summers ago, when you said you'd never need to know." He met her eye. "The door locks from the inside. You throw the bolt the second I'm through it. If anyone comes through that door who is not me, you don't ask them anything. You point this at the center of them, and you pull until it stops. Do you understand me?" She looked at the gun, and then at him, and the assistant who filed everything and gave away nothing was for one bare moment entirely gone. "Don't make me plan your funeral," she said, very low. "I cancelled the suit fitting. I am not catering a funeral on top of it." His mouth did the almost smile again. "I'm calling off a wedding this week," he said. "I'm not adding your funeral to it." And he went out and stood in the corridor until he heard the heavy bolt slide home behind him with a single solid sound, and only then did he turn toward the stairs and let the cold arithmetic of the night take the wheel. They took the depot at 4 in the morning, in the rain, without a single raised voice. Raphael did not go himself, much as every nerve in him wanted to. The plan needed him visible elsewhere, back at the Hollows, by first light, loud and red-faced, and playing the betrayed employer for any eyes Drazen had on the street. So, he sent Tomas and 4 men he trusted with the part of his life that had no paperwork, and he gave them exactly one instruction before they rolled out. "The boy walks out of there breathing, and so does anyone who hands him over without making me regret it. The choice belongs to them, not to you." The depot was a long steel shed at the dead end of a service road, ringed by chain link and dead floodlights. A few box trucks nosed up to the loading bays like animals at a trough. Thomas's men came over the back fence in the dark and were inside before the rain had finished sliding off the wire. The 2 men sitting on Cyrus turned out to be freelancers, local muscle, hired by the night, paid in cash by a voice on a phone they'd never match to a face. They were not, as it developed, paid nearly enough to die for a stranger's secret on a wet Tuesday, when 4 armed men they did not recognize filled the only doorway, and Tomas asked them conversationally whether they had families. Both of them discovered they would very much like to keep having them, and slid their weapons across the floor with their boots. Thomas did the thing that closed the plot's last open door before it could swing. He took their phones, both of them. He dropped the SIM cards into a puddle and pocketed the handsets, and he sat the 2 freelancers in the back of a windowless van with one of his men for company, where they could not call, could not text, could not send so much as a single word up the chain to the man who had hired them. As far as Drazenkova would know for the rest of the night, the depot was exactly as quiet and exactly as handled as it had been at midnight. The witness was still in his box. The screen was still up, nothing had moved. Cyrus Reyes came out of that back office, thin and shaking and squinting against the headlights. 19 years old and 3 weeks into a nightmare he'd walked into with a phone in his hand. The first words out of him were not, "Thank you," and were not, "Who are you?" They were, "Is my sister okay? Is Mary okay? Did they?" And Tomas, who had a younger sister of his own 3 states away and called her every Sunday, found that he liked the boy immediately and entirely. "She's safe," Tomas told him, steering him toward the car with one broad hand between his shoulder blades. "Hurt, but safe, and somewhere no one's getting to her tonight. She sent the man who sent us." Cyrus started to cry, then the ugly, graceless crying of a young man who has been holding it for 3 weeks, and got into the car and let himself be driven toward the first safe place he'd seen since he looked inside a crate. The seam held. By mid-morning, the other half of Marisol's plan was doing its quiet work across the city. Otter reached Drazen, through a dock foreman, through a cleaner, through the small porous channels that carry rumor in a place like this, that Rafael Moreno had spent a fortune in the middle of the night buying a collapsing tenement in the hollows, and was down there in person tearing the walls open and roaring that his secretary had embezzled him blind and run. And Drazen, careful, clever, suddenly an enormously relieved Drazen, who believed his letter had worked, and his witness was still folded safely in a box, and his year-long secret was sealed behind a wall of paper, did precisely the thing Marisol had said a relaxed, clever man would do. He came to gloat. He telephoned that afternoon, all warmth and brotherly concern, the easy voice that made hard things sound small. "I heard about Marisol. God, Raphael, I'm so sorry. I always said there was something a little off about her, didn't I? Too quiet, too tidy. The tidy ones are always hiding something. Let me help you. I know people who can find anyone in this city, inside a day. Where do you want to start? Let me bring the books over tonight. We'll trace every cent she touched, and we'll have her by the weekend." "Come to the tower tonight," Raphael said, and let his voice shake with exactly the right measure of hot, humiliated fury. The performance Marisol had written for him, played note for note. 9 o'clock. Bring whoever you need. I want her found. Drazen. I want everything she ever laid a hand on, torn open and turned out on the floor." "Of course," Drazen said, and under the warmth, there was a small, bright thread of satisfaction. The pleasure of a clever man watching a clumsier one stumble in exactly the direction he'd been pointed. "Of course, I'll bring everything." And that thread of satisfaction, that private warm enjoyment of another person's ruin, was very nearly the last unguarded feeling Drazenkova would ever have. He came at 9. He came up to the 42nd floor with 2 of his own men and a fat leather folio of documents he meant to use to bury a woman he was certain was already buried, and he crossed straight to the wet bar and poured himself 2 fingers of Raphael's whiskey without asking, the way he always had. The small daily theft of a man who had spent 6 years assuming everything in the room flowed naturally toward him. He was 3 sentences into a smooth speech about offshore transfers and suspicious withdrawals, when Raphael, seated behind the wide steel desk in the cold gray light, reached out and slid a single photograph across the surface toward him. It was the one from the suitcase lining, the crate, the faces inside it. Drazen stopped talking. The warmth went out of him all at once the way heat leaves a body. First the face, then the hands, then the eyes. His gaze dropped to the photograph, jumped to Raphael's face, and then, far, far too late, went to the door where Thomas had quietly stepped in and set his back against it, and then to the side room where a thin young man with Marisol's exact dark eyes stepped out into the light, alive, unharmed. Here. The witness who was supposed to be folded in a box at the bottom of the sea. She found all of it, Drazen, Raphael said, and stood unhurried. The shell, the bond on Pier 9, the whole filthy year of it. She found it weeks ago, and then she let you break her hand and burn down her own life, rather than risk a single thread of it blowing back onto me. That's a loyalty you've never once felt toward another living soul, so I won't waste either of our time expecting you to understand it. He came around the desk. Drazen's two men had not reached for their weapons. Somewhere in the last 4 seconds they had run the same arithmetic the freelancers had run, and arrived at the same total, because no one in this trade dies for a man who has already visibly lost. You ran people, through my peers, under my flag, using the one trade I made. Every man in this house swear we'd never touch. You broke her hand on a kitchen counter and then made her write a letter, in her own hand, telling me to let her go. And the part I can't get past the people in the crate, past her hand, all of it, is that yesterday morning, in this room, you poured my whiskey and reminded me to wear the blue. You stood at my father's grave. And you've been selling me by the pound, the entire time. Drazen's mouth opened. Whatever was meant to come out of it, a denial, a deal, a name to trade, a plea never arrived, because he had built his entire life out of words, and there were on this one night no words left in him that did any work at all. Raphael did the thing his world required of him, and he did it without heat now, and without hesitation. The hot performance burned all the way down to the cold thing underneath it. When it was done, the scrubbed and pressurized air carried even that away, because that, in the end, was what the air was for. He did not feel triumphant. He stood over what was left of 6 years of trust, and felt instead the particular hollow quiet of a man who has cut a rotten thing out of his own body and is only now, with it gone, learning how far into him its roots had grown. He had the 2 freelancers' employer matched, and the side channel partner Drazen had used at the bond identified before midnight. Marisol's files gave it all up, every layer, walked to the bottom, because she always walked them all. He gave the orders that needed giving, and then he turned his back on the desk, and the folio, and the cooling photograph, because there was something 3 floors below that mattered infinitely more than any of it. Someone awake when she should have been asleep, refusing to let the fever take her under until she knew. The door to the suite was locked from the inside. He had told her to throw the bolt. He had not entirely let himself expect that she would. "It's me," he said, and knocked, twice evenly, and stood back from the door so the spy-hole would catch all of him. There was a long pause, and then the sound of the bolt drawing back, slow, awkward, one-handed, hampered by the splint. The door opened. She stood in the gap holding the frame to keep upright, swallowed in a clean dark shirt of his that someone had found and put on her, her hair down for the first time in the 3 years he had known her, loose around the bruised ruin of her face. And, in her good hand, hanging at her side, with the safety still thumbed on, the way he'd shown her 2 summers ago, was the flat little pistol, held the way she held everything, correctly, attentively, ready, and praying not to be. "You didn't shoot me," he said. "You knocked," she said. Her one good eye moved over him, his face, his hands, the cuffs of his shirt, reading the night off his body, the way she read a ledger, line by line, and whatever she found written there made her go very still. "Is it, Cyrus, is 2 floors down in my kitchen," Raphael said, eating his way through everything in it. "He's asked for you 11 times. He cried on Tomas, who has decided he likes him, which never happens." And he watched the name Cyrus go through her, like current through a wire, watched the strength go out of her knees all at once, and caught her before she could fold. Gently, both arms, mindful of the rib and the hand and the 100 smaller hurts he was still learning the map of. She did not fight him this time. She put her forehead against his chest and made a single sound, low and broken. 3 weeks of held breath leaving her body in one ragged push. And he stood in the doorway of a hidden room 3 floors beneath the cleanest air in the city and held the entire weight of her, which was almost nothing at all, and understood that it was the heaviest and most important thing he had ever carried in his life. He's really... She started, and couldn't finish it. He's safe. He's not going back to that depot, that van, or that street. None of it. It's finished, Marisol. He moved a hand over her loose hair, an awkward, unpracticed motion, a man teaching himself in real time a gentleness he'd never before had any occasion to use. Drazen's done. It was only him at the top, exactly the way you laid it out. The freelancers folded the second. The math turned against them. His partner at the bond gave himself up before midnight, trying to make a deal. There was no deal left to make. The piers are clean. Pier 9 is shut. Nobody is ever going to come up those stairs on Farrow Lane after your brother, or after you, again. She laughed then, a real one. Wet and cracked and disbelieving, the 5th genuine laugh he had heard from her in 3 years, and he found he was keeping count of those too now, the way he'd once kept count without knowing why. You can't just buy people's buildings, Raphael, that isn't. There are laws, there's a process. You can't. The deed's already in your name, not mine, he said. I had Wexler change it this afternoon, while I was busy down at Farrow pretending to tear your walls apart for an audience. It's yours. The whole building. You can keep it, sell it, fix the heat, evict the man who sold you to Drazen, fill every unit with stray cats. I genuinely do not care which. But no one is ever going to put a notice on your door again, because the door is yours now, all the way down to the street. He paused. I'm told this kind of thing is a flaw in my character. Yusuf says it's the same flaw that's going to get me killed one day. I told him I'd risk it. She pressed her face harder against him and didn't answer, and he understood that the not answering was the answer, and let her have the silence. She slept for 16 hours. When she finally woke, the rain had stopped for the first time in a week, and Halvridge lay washed and gleaming under a hard, clean morning light. 2 floors down, Cyrus was asleep on a sofa under a blanket that had cost more than his van, exhausted into a child's deep sleep now that someone else was finally keeping the watch. Raphael was sitting in a chair by the window of the suite, with 2 cups of coffee on the small table at his elbow, the first one gone cold and untouched, the second one steaming. He had made them himself, down in the kitchen, and he'd had to ask the cook which cup was which and in what order, and the cook had looked at him as though he'd asked which end of a gun to hold. You don't drink the first one, he said, when he saw that her eye had opened. You stopped bringing me the first one 18 months ago, and I never said anything. But I noticed. I noticed nearly everything, Marisol. I always have. That was the entire problem. I noticed, and I never asked. I noticed your sleeves, and the bruise, and the money on the first of the month, and the second cup. And I filed every one of them exactly the way you taught me to file things, and I never once turned the file over. Marisol pushed herself up against the headboard, the splinted hand settling in her lap, and she looked at him, at the dangerous, careful man who had knelt on her filthy kitchen floor in a $3,000 coat, bought a building at 2 in the morning, torn his own house down to the foundation, walked away from a decade-long treaty and the cleanest air in the city, and was now sitting in a chair, fussing over which cup of coffee went to whom. The careful woman who filed everything and gave away nothing felt the last of her walls come down, not knocked down, not stormed, but simply lowered, because for the first time in 3 weeks, in 3 years, in longer than that, there was nothing left standing on the other side of them that she needed to defend against. But before she could speak, the burner phone on the windowsill buzzed, hard, against the wood. Raphael picked it up, glanced at the screen, a northern area code, and answered it without taking his eyes off her. Moreno. The voice that came through was not the smooth, expansive voice of a patriarch arranging a profitable marriage. It was tight and cold, and edged with the particular fury of a powerful man who has just been told no by someone he assumed he had already bought. Raphael let the elder Albrecht talk himself out, the church already booked, the families already told, the insult of it, the cost of it, and when the older man finally ran out of breath, Raphael spoke, and his voice was perfectly level. You'll have heard by now that there was a man inside my house, running people through my piers, he said, under my flag, through accounts, your own suspicious accountants. We're 2 days from inspecting. He's handled. The piers are clean. But I'll be plain with you, because you've earned plain. The engagement is finished. Sabine is free, as of this morning, to make any arrangement she likes, with my respect and no hard feeling. On my side, she and I were a contract. Never anything warmer. And she'll be relieved more than wounded if she's honest with herself. A pause. I know what this costs me. I know I'm cutting loose the rail lines and the judges and the better part of a decade of work and what that does to next year's margins, and I'm doing it anyway. If you want to make it a war over a wedding, that was only ever a spreadsheet. That's a decision you're free to make. But you should make it knowing that the woman who found the rot in my house, in time to save us both, is sitting across the room from me right now, and that I would rather have her keeping my books than have your rail lines. Think about what that tells you. He let that sit a moment. Be well, Albrecht. Don't call this number again. And he ended the call and dropped the phone back on the sill and looked at her. Marisol was staring at him. You can't be serious. You just, over the phone, just like that, you cut off the Albrechts, Raphael? That's 20% of your gross before you count the judges. You'll feel that hole every quarter for 2 years. Somebody is going to have to restructure the entire northern exposure now and reroute the freight you were going to run on their rail and renegotiate the I know, Raphael said. And the Foundation's quarterly is due in 2 weeks, and there's a hole in the offshore structure now shaped exactly like Drazenkova that the auditors will flag the instant they look. And you are going to be completely, catastrophically hopeless at all of it without. She stopped. She heard herself. Her good eye came up to his. Without you, Raphael finished, gently. Yes, I know that too. I've known it for about a year and refused to look at the file. He rose and crossed to the bed and lowered himself to her level the way he had on the kitchen floor on Farrow Lane, so that she would not have to look up at him for this part. So, here's the new arrangement, and it isn't a negotiation. You don't have a desk anymore. Something flickered across her bruised face, old reflex, the deep, animal fear of being made useless. The same fear that had driven her to starve a whole life, down to a folded blanket and a chipped mug, rather than ever once allow herself to be a burden anyone could put down. He saw it cross her, because he had finally, expensively, learned how to see it. That's not. He stopped himself, set down the smooth sentence he'd half prepared, and did the harder thing. Told her the truth with nothing dressed over it. You ran my entire world from a chair in a hallway for 3 years, and I let you, because it was convenient. The same convenience that let me believe your bruise was a cabinet, and your home was safe, and your brother was just a word you said sometimes. I have spent 3 years allowing myself to be convenienced into half-seeing, the most capable person I've ever met. I'm finished. I don't want an assistant who builds a wall around me out of habit and then bleeds quietly to keep it standing. I want the woman who looked at the cleverest, most careful trader in my house and worked out in under a minute how to make him walk into a room on his own feet, believing it was his idea. I want a partner. The desk is gone. The hallway is gone. From now on, you sit at the table across from me, where I can see you, and where, the next time something is wrong, I'll be near enough to ask. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out with her good hand and picked up the first cup of coffee, the cold one, the one neither of them ever drank, and turned it slowly in her fingers, watching the skin shiver on the cooled surface, as though she were deciding something far larger than coffee. The Cayman files are labeled in the green drive, she said at last, and her voice was uneven in a way it had never once been in 3 years of briefings. And I prefer the second cup. Hot. I always have. I just never had a minute in 3 years to sit down and drink it before it went cold. Her eye came up to his, raw and clear, and finally, completely awake. The assessment gone out of it at last, because there was nothing left anywhere in the room that needed to be assessed for threat. "Okay, Raphael, okay," he said. He did not smile, because he was not a man who smiled. But something in his face unguarded itself completely, down to a layer she had never been permitted to see in 3 years of standing outside his door, and he leaned in and pressed his lips to her forehead, over the bruise, carefully, and lingered there. And it was not the beginning of anything, so much as the plain acknowledgement of a thing that had quietly been true for a very long time, and had at last run out of reasons to keep hiding. The cleanest air in Halvridge moved through the open window of the room, and for the first time in years it did not smell of nothing at all. It smelled of coffee, and of rain coming off the river, and of the particular warmth of a place where, against every single rule he had ever set down for himself, Rafael Moreno had finally let a life back in. Marisol Reyes spent 3 years being the quietest person in the loudest world there is, building a wall around a man who never once thought to ask her a real question, and when the fire finally came, she walked into it alone rather than let a single ember touch him. He bought a whole building just to keep her from disappearing. But what he was really buying back was every question he'd never asked, every bruise he'd let her hide behind a long sleeve, every single morning he'd taken the second cup of coffee without ever once wondering whose hands had poured the first. That's the thing about the quiet ones. They hold the entire world together with both hands, in cooled rooms, with bedsheets for curtains, and they never ever tell you that they're bleeding. The most powerful person in any empire is almost never the one sitting behind the big desk. It's the one in the chair just outside the door. The one you've stopped seeing, precisely because they've never once let you down. So if this story got to you, if you felt that moment when he knelt down on that freezing kitchen floor and finally saw her, then do me one favor, hit that like button, subscribe for more dark slow burn Mafia stories where the overlooked ones turn out to be holding all the power the whole time. And send this to the one person who needs reminding that loyalty, like Marisol's, is rarer than any treaty. And tell me down in the comments, what was the exact moment you knew Raphael was going to burn it all down for her? Was it the building, the whiskey line, the second cup of coffee? I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story.